Thank you for that kind welcome, and thanks to the Federalist Society and the Hispanic Law Students Association for sponsoring this, and thank you for the sign holders, your cogent argumentation. I hope you'll try not to be too distracted. I want to also introduce Mariah Day and Craig McCullough, my staff, if you guys want to give your hand. And then my daughter Lily, who's 11 years old, is here. Lily, want to stand up? Lily is either going to be a lawyer or a chef. I'm not sure which one. She may try to combine them both and have like legal services in a restaurant. So we'll see how it works. But she wanted to come along and see Daddy talk about this. Let me begin with the political, that's to say the laws that we adopted through the political process in Kansas, offer some statistics on them, and then talk about the legal battles, some of which I've been litigating. Most of the ones I'll talk about I've been litigating personally. The SAFE Act, the Secure Fair Elections Act of 2011, was something that I drafted with help from the staff and the Kansas legislature passed in the 2011 legislative session. It did three things. So the first state in America to combine all these three things. Other states have done one or the other, but were the first to do all three. Photo ID for when you vote in a Kansas election. And we have a very permissive list, unlike Texas, which is a fairly restrictive list, a very permissive list. So student ID counts, tribal ID counts, different welfare ID counts. Those things aren't, for example, included in the more restrictive list, such as in Texas. Second thing was equivalent security for mail-in ballots. And anyone who studied election mechanics know that if you really want to commit fraud, the best way to do it is through a mail-in ballot. You don't have to face real people. And so we have provisions that require that your signature be verified before the mail-in ballot is sent to you. In other words, a human eyeball matches your signature to the signature on file for that name. And then also you have to provide either a photocopy of a photo ID with your mail-in ballot on the outside of the ballot before it's opened, of course. Or a full Kansas driver's license number. I'm sorry, when you request the ballot, you provide those two things. And then the third thing we have is proof of citizenship when you register to vote. So those three things are the elements that Kansas combined. If you're following the news in Kansas in 2015, in the past legislative session, the legislature added to that prosecutorial authority for the Secretary of State's office and the Attorney General's office over election-related crimes. Previously, that only existed at the county level. And I believe we're the first state in the union to have that authority vested in the Secretary of State's office. Since then, a number of states have followed Kansas's model. If you look at the Alabama proof of citizenship law, you'll find that it's almost exactly the same wording. Just scratch out the word Kansas and put it in Alabama, you'll have the law. Good way to do your research sometimes, and it worked for them. In Pennsylvania, they adopted a variant of our security for mail-in ballots. In Oregon, you'll soon see in the news a popular initiative, which is essentially the Kansas proof of citizenship law that's going to be placed before voters after they collect the signature. I'm not sure which election cycle. Probably, I'm not sure if it should be 2016 or 2018. So we've seen other states follow the Kansas model. And a couple things to note about this passage of the laws. One is that it was bipartisan. 2/3 of the Democrats in the Kansas House voted for it. Most, but not quite all, of the Republicans in the House voted for it. In the Senate, 3/4 of the Democrats in the Kansas Senate voted for it. In the same year, in 2011, the Rhode Island legislature passed a photo ID law, just photo ID. They are controlled by Democrats, were controlled by the Democrat Party then, and are still controlled, and had an independent governor. So this had bipartisan support in 2011 in many, many states. What changed between now and then is that the Voltaire Justice Department, along with the Obama administration more broadly in its political efforts, decided that this was going to be a wedge issue, an issue to motivate some voters, and so they started attacking photo ID as somehow racially biased, and we may get to that in our discussion today. But I'll save some of my answers for that particular subject later, because we've only got 20 minutes now. So why do we do it? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is that election fraud occurs, and people always, you'll hear this argument many times, and they'll say, well, look, if you only have X number of cases of election fraud, but you have 1.2 million votes cast, that's a tiny fraction. But of course, that's a red herring. That's not the question. The question is, do you have any close elections, and is the number of fraudulent votes sufficient or close to sufficient to steal the election? And there the answer frequently is yes. Some evidence we presented to federal district court a couple years ago, we pointed out that over a 10-year period, there were 24 Kansas elections where the margin of victory was 50 votes or less for state legislature level or for Congress. 50 votes or less, 24 of them. We had one dead tie. We had 3 under 5 votes or less margin. And so it happens all the time. And if you look at county and local elections and school board elections, it happens with amazing regularity. I mean, amazing regularity. If you look at, because in those races, oftentimes there are fewer than 2,000 votes cast. And you have it down to under 10 votes all the time at that level. In fact, we had a dead tie in Kansas City, Kansas, just this last election cycle in the spring of 2015. A dead tie in the primary for the city council of the unified government of Kansas City. So very common in those situations. So if you have a handful of fraudulent cases, then that's enough to swing it in a close election. So when we went to the legislature in 2011 to propose the enactment of this bill, we presented 231 cases of fraud, actually 220 some in 2011. Then by 2012, the number was up to 231 cases reported by county clerks in Kansas from 1997 to 2010. So you can divide that out and say however many it is per election cycle. But those were credible cases that the county clerks had passed along to the Secretary of State's office. Some of the more numerous examples were in Wyandotte County in the 2004-2002 election cycles. There was a lot of vote-by-mail fraud. People were fraudulently requesting other people's ballots. It's still unclear whether they were intending to intercept them at the mailbox or they were just intending to have them at the mail ballot sent to the person to drive up participation in that party, in that sector, who knows, in that neighborhood. But at any rate, there were over 50 cases of that type. We have a fairly large number of cases of non-citizens voting. And after looking at this issue for many, many years, it's my conclusion that in many cases, the individual doesn't even know that what he's doing is against the law. For example, in 1997 in Seward County, Kansas, that's in southwest Kansas, there's a really notorious case of a county ballot issue on whether or not a certain hog processing operation would be allowed in the county. Kansas law required that the county residents could oppose it and then put the issue on the ballot. The issue was being pushed by the hog processing plant in Guymon, Oklahoma, just over the border. They wanted to raise the hogs in Kansas, process them in Guymon, Oklahoma. The county clerk reported to the Kansas legislature, when we talked about this case in front of the legislature, she reported that about, a couple months before the election, a big manila envelope arrived at the county election office with about 50 voter registration cards in it. All of them coming from the return address on the envelope was the Guymon meat processing plant. These were employees of the plant who were all registering, and many of the addresses were all for Seward County. Many of them were made-up addresses. It was her belief and her staff's belief, looking at some of the names, that many of the individuals were not U.S. citizens, based on first-hand knowledge of some of the individuals in question. But there was no statute that allowed her to refuse to register anyone or to ask for more information. So she did. On election day, minivan after minivan load came up from the Guymon plant with employees in the van, and they came up to vote on the referendum. And they had a translator with them who translate from English to their native Spanish what the issue was and how they were supposed to vote. All the county clerk could do was instruct the translator not to tell them how to vote. That she had no authority to do anything else. At the end of the day, they did not steal the election. The plant, the hog farming operation was defeated. But that was an example of an organized effort to use people who are not eligible voters, and probably most of those people didn't even know they were breaking the law, I would imagine. But it happened with some frequency at the local level. You don't usually see national elections stolen, you don't usually see statewide elections stolen, but you can see county, state representative, and in some cases, even a congressional race. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what happens statistically. Are we at 10 minutes yet? Okay. In the 2012 election, one of the big questions was, all right, you're going to require people to provide photo ID. What about people who don't have a photo ID? Of course, the Kansas law allows anyone who doesn't have a photo ID to simply fill out an affidavit. You don't have to prove that you're too poor to afford one. You just simply sign an affidavit saying, I don't have one of the listed IDs, and I'd like one, please. And you must be given a photo ID for free. Very few of those were actually handed out before the election. The number was somewhere between 100 and 200 over the entire state before that election. On election day, there were 1,182,000 votes cast. And of those, only 838 provisional ballots were issued for lack of sufficient voter ID. That amounts to 0.07%, or 0.07%, or less than 1,000 votes. You're also given the opportunity, if you didn't bring your photo ID with you on election day, you have up until 6 or 9 days, depending on the county, to bring your photo ID in afterwards and make your ballot go from the provisional pile of no ID to the provisional pile will be counted. So you can make your vote count by bringing it in afterward. Of those 838, 306 did so. So a little bit less than half. And so the total dropped to 532 votes not counted for lack of ID. That's 0.04%. And remember, these people are in the interesting position of they've already seen the election. They already know who won. And so many of them will just choose not to bring in their ID because, look, the only races I cared about were won by several thousand votes. So at any rate, we even looked at those 532 people and to see if we could find anyone that truly lacked an ID. So we started comparing them to the driver's license database. We were unable to find anyone who didn't have a photo ID. We even sent out mailers to those people saying, if you don't have a photo ID, we'll help you get it. And to this day, we aren't able to find anyone who truly lacked the photo ID. We had similar results in the 2014 election. The total turnout was, a total number of registered voters, 1.7 million. The turnout was 50%, 856,000 cast. Only 570 provisional ballots issued due to lack of sufficient photo ID. Out of those, 267 provided ID before the county, so about half before the county canvas. Again, about 0.03%, or 1 in 3,000, ended up not providing ID at all during the process. So a really tiny percentage. And I think those statistics indicate that really we're talking, one of the arguments that was made before photo ID laws kind of swept the country in 2011 and 2012 was that there are masses of people who don't have photo ID and somehow can't make their way to a county DMV office to get one. And that just hasn't proven out statistically. Let me quickly go to some of the legal cases. I think this is a loss, so maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. So there are several cases. One of these is the case you should probably be familiar with, as we've taken election law, undoubtedly familiar with. Marion County versus Crawford, 2008, Supreme Court decides by a 6-3 decision that photo ID does not fundamentally infringe upon anyone's voting rights, written by that noted conservative Justice Stevens. So, obviously, this is not a, at least in 2008, this is not certainly one that the Supreme Court had any disagreement on with respect to the voting rights of people when required to present a photo ID. The next big case to come down the pike was Arizona versus Intertropical Council of Arizona, or ITCA. That was in 2013. And I watched these cases. I was a law professor at UMKC for 15 years, and I gave up that job when I became Secretary of State. I watched these cases as they were coming down the pike, especially Marion County. But Arizona versus Intertribe is really interesting. Arizona was the first, I believe, state to adopt proof of citizenship. And there are the vast majority of people who register to vote register using a state form. If you go to your driver's license, if you go to DMV, you're given a digital version of the state registration form. Fewer than 1% of the people in America register using this federal form. Federal form was created by the NVRA, National Voter Registration Act, of 1993. And the federal form is, typical of federal government, it's a 25-page form, which has information you fill out on the front page and 24 pages of different state instructions. And Arizona said, well, we have proof of citizenship. The federal form currently, as Arizona sits, the Arizona instructions doesn't require proof of citizenship. We're just going to say we're going to reject federal forms that don't include proof of citizenship because our law trumps. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court starts with two conclusions. Number one, Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution has impact and has meaning in today's society. Article 1, Section 2, for those of you who don't remember off the top of your head, says that the qualifications for electors, meaning voters, the qualifications for voters in Congress shall be the same as the qualifications for voting for the most numerous branch of the state legislature. This was a big deal. The framers were debating the possibility of saying, we'll control who votes, we'll have a separate sort of federal voter roll, and we decide who votes. Of course, in that time, maintaining voter rolls would have been truly astonishing undertaking, but we would decide the qualifications for voting for Congress. And that was a non-starter. The Constitution had not been ratified. So they said, all right, we'll let the states have their own rules. States like Pennsylvania had property qualifications still at that time. And we will allow each state to decide how their voter rolls are determined, who's qualified to vote, who's not. And we will allow those people who are qualified in the state level to vote for Congress in that state. And so the Supreme Court reaffirms that principle, says that that still means that the states control who is qualified to vote, and the states control the policing of who is qualified to vote, logically, if they control the qualifications for vote. The second principle, though, is that the Supreme Court in Arizona versus ITCA said that the National Voter Registration Act means what it says when it says the states shall accept and use the federal form. So if you want to use the federal form to register, the states have to take it. So Arizona lost because they were saying, well, we're just not going to take the federal form if you don't include proof of citizenship. But Justice Scalia, writing for the court, which I think was also 6-3, I think it was 7-2. I don't know, it was a supermajority court in that opinion too. Justice Scalia said at the end of the opinion, to be exact, and passed around it, he said, well, there's an easy way out of this. All Arizona needs to do is request to the Election Assistance Commission, this agency that controls the content of the federal form, request that your instruction be changed and says, so that it says in Arizona you have to provide proof of citizenship. So that leads us to the final chapter, which is the case of Kobach and Bennett versus EAC. Yours truly and the Secretary of State of Arizona versus EAC. We requested, we did what the Supreme Court said in their roadmap of ITCA. We said, all right, well, we would like our state instructions to include proof of citizenship. We won at the federal district court level, Judge Melbourne here in Kansas. We went to the 10th Circuit, had a panel that didn't quite see it the same way. Judge Lucero, who was actually on the, he just started his tenure on the 10th Circuit when I clerked there. And, you know, I knew going in we would have a tough time persuading Judge Lucero, and indeed we did. Judge Lucero said the state did not present sufficient evidence to the EAC to warrant changing our instructions, which is pretty odd considering that that would mean that an unelected federal agency would get to trump Article 1, Section 2. Article 1, Section 2 says the state decides how we're going to police registration. But then the 10th Circuit, with Lucero writing, says, no, this federal agency will tell the states whether you made a good decision or not, and they will decide. So at any rate, we petitioned for cert. We didn't have a cert split. There may be a case coming up out of the 11th Circuit with Arizona and Georgia, not Arizona, Alabama and Georgia coming up. But at that point, we didn't have a circuit split, so the Supreme Court didn't take the case. So the case is still, this issue is far from settled. The EAC didn't have any commissioners at the time. Now this federal commission does. We will be reapproaching EAC with another request for a set of instructions at some point. There may be a case that comes out of those other states. So the battle continues on that particular issue. In sum, I want to quickly go to the issue of turnout and racial disparity. These are the two arguments, and I assume Mark might bring them up, about photo ID. Does photo ID reduce turnout? Not in Kansas. We know this because you can compare the turnout if you compare apples to apples. Now, there was a GAO report which tried to, it's a really tough thing to isolate. You know, if you vote in an election, why did you vote in that election? Did you vote because there was a candidate you cared about? Did you vote because you worked on a campaign? Did you vote because you saw commercials that made you care about this candidate? Or did you vote or not vote based on whether you have an ID in your pocket? Well, you have to isolate all these factors. And so they tried to compare different states, and they found a minimal, they were comparing Kansas to like Maine. They put Kansas and Tennessee as their two states to look at. But I would argue that's an apples to oranges comparison. The only way you can really look at turnout in a state and say this factor affected it, even then you probably still can't reach a firm conclusion, is to look at the same state, the same electorate in comparable elections. So they looked at the 2012 election. In the 2012 election, there was no U.S. senator on the ballot. If you do your math and figure out how the rotation of senators occurs, every 12 years, in every state, there will be an election where there is no U.S. Senate candidate on the ballot. That was 2012 in Kansas. 2012 non-presidential elections, or rather presidential elections in Kansas do not coincide with any of the statewides being on the ballot either. So you have no statewide campaign at all doing get out the vote efforts. Get out the vote efforts are postcards saying, please vote, here, we'll help you get your mail-in ballot. Fill out this card, they'll send, just send it in, we've already done everything for you. There was none of that in 2012. So you got to go back 12 years to the year 2000. The Bush v. Gore election, similar, no U.S. Senate candidate, no statewide elections, but a presidential campaign going on. Kansas, as you know, is taken for granted in presidential campaigns. Neither side really does much of anything because it's so reliably a red state since last time Kansas voted for the Democrat was 1964 in the presidential contest. So if you look at 2000 and 2012, you find that turnout actually was almost identical. It went up 0.1% in 2012. versus turnout in 2000. So we would argue that it has a negligible impact on turnout in Kansas. If anything, if you want to look at the 0.1% to 1%, you would say it's positive, but I'd say that's statistically insignificant. And as far as the racial issue, I mean, in Kansas, we don't track a person's race. When you register to vote, the state doesn't know what your race is. So there's no way to look at voter turnout, look at our official, the voting history of every person and say, okay, well, turnout went up on this race and went down on that race. So there's no way to truly know. There have been some studies presented in the case in Texas, and even there, they don't have actual racial data. What they're trying to do is extrapolate from voters' last names and try to figure out these people's races from their last names. Again, obviously, I can imagine the reason for that would be considered pretty sloppy, but there's really no evidence that it has a racially disparate impact. And turnout, no evidence that it's persuasive, certainly. And so I think on balance, people like photo ID. The court battles continue, but the big ones in the Supreme Court, certainly for photo ID, have been won by the states. Thank you.
Most of the entire audience, 237 people, over 13 years. And
Sir,
much rather disenfranchise.
Sir, you have your opportunity to speak
Over
when
that
you
same
want.
statistic. Wow. That's the thrust of your entire argument? Wow. I thought I was stuck in the moment this time. Go ahead.
You know, I teach, I'm Mark Johnson, and among other things, I teach a class on the First Amendment here. And I firmly believe in the right of free expression, but the right of free expression courteously exercised, sir. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
With that in mind, let me get into what I'm supposed to be here about. And I echo Kris's comments about thanking the Federal Society and the Hispanic Law Students Association for hosting this forum or discussion, however you want to characterize it. As was indicated in the introductions, I'm going to approach this in a somewhat, I guess you say, more objective fashion than the Secretary did. But I certainly understand why the Secretary approaches it in the way he does. He is invested in this process. And let me tell you, before you think about Secretary Kobach, let me tell you that I've known him for over 20 years. He was a summer associate at my law firm in 1994. I think highly of him. He is an extremely bright person. He's serious-minded, and you should take him seriously. The arguments he makes are compelling. If you disagree with him, fine. But don't consider his arguments on an ad hominem basis. There are many people in the United States who agree with Secretary Kobach, and I would simply ask you, if you disagree with him, be serious in your disagreement and not personal. With that in mind, let me open by quoting a philosopher, Voltaire. Voltaire said, "The perfect is the enemy of the good." That phrase works when you're talking about legislation, it works when you're talking about architecture, and, among other things, it works when you're talking about elections. Do we want our elections to be perfect? In theory, yes. But the system in the United States is, at a minimum, very, very good. Do we want to lose that? Do we want to put that at risk by seeking the perfect? Just think about that. Now, just like any professor, it's so much easier when you have a PowerPoint. And if this thing comes up, it will make things so much better received. Okay, all right, it works. Okay, so objectively, let me give a little history of voter ID laws. Now, there's a distinction that we need to draw. Photo ID is a subset, if you will, of voter ID. Voter ID is simply a requirement that the voter prove his or her identity when he or she goes to vote. And that can be by anything that has the voter's name, address, etc. It doesn't have to have the voter's photograph. So photo ID is sort of a layer that has been put on top of some existing voter ID laws. The voter ID laws are not an entirely new phenomenon. We've had them, by and large, in several states since the 1970s. So for a long time, several states have required voters to come to the polls with some sort of identification. In fact, by 2000, 14 states required it. Not all photo ID by any means, but voter ID. So then we had the 2000 election. Some of you may even remember it. Had a little problem in Florida. And in Florida, there were two things working, a number of things, but two from an important point of view. First were the voters who, in essence, by candidate, made mistakes when they voted. There wasn't a true voter ID issue in Florida. The other thing had to do, of course, with the purging of voter rolls and a number of people showing up at the polls being told, well, you're not registered anymore, when in fact they should have been, but somebody with a name similar to theirs had resulted in them losing their registration. So shortly after the 2000 election, a commission was put together, chaired by former President Carter and James Baker, both prominent, highly credible politicians. They issued a report in 2005 with a number of recommendations. One of those was that voter identification should be seriously considered by the states. I should point out that literally within the past week, President Carter has backed away from that recommendation. He's now expressing second thoughts about it. But in 2005, that was something that was being seriously proposed for the states to adopt. Then, as Secretary Kobach mentioned, came 2008 when the Supreme Court decided Crawford versus Marion County. Indiana had passed a photo ID law in 2005. You want to vote in Indiana, you had to come to the polls with some sort of photo identification. And as the case with all of these photo ID laws that the states have passed, the types of ID you can bring to the polls varies somewhat from state to state. But there are certain ones that are always in that list. Driver's licenses, passports are the two that are in nearly, well, or all of them. But the rest of them, you have a slightly different mix. But as the court in Crawford indicated, and this is as Kris indicated, Justice Stevens, he said that the only kind of voter fraud that the bill addresses is in-person voter impersonation at polling places. With the Indiana law, you didn't have a photo ID, you would vote a provisional ballot, and then within 10 days, you would have to take a photo ID to the county election board, and then your vote would be counted. Since the Crawford case, a number of states have enacted laws requiring voters to prove their identities with photo identification. The articulated rationale of the advocates of these laws is that they combat in-person voter fraud. The other side of the coin, the arguments raised a counter to the advocates of voter ID is that they suppress, that the effect is to suppress the votes of poor folks, elderly folks, minorities. And if you want to get partisan about it, that vote tends to be Democratic. And the fact is that in the preponderant majority of the states that have adopted photo identification since the Crawford case, those states have been controlled largely by Republican legislators and a Republican governor. 2010 seems to have been a seminal election for these voter ID laws, photo ID laws, because with the legislatures and the governors elected in that election, we saw in 2011 a number of states, such as Kansas, enact photo ID laws. So since 2011, we've seen 12 states adopt photo ID laws. Let me give you sort of the other side of the coin. What happens in states where you have mixed government? Don't tell us the many people, I actually live in Missouri. I'm close to Kansas. If I had a strong arm, I could throw a rock into Kansas. I live right up in Hills Park in Kansas City, Missouri. But in my state of Missouri, we actually had a photo ID law. It was passed in 2002, and it was declared unconstitutional by our state Supreme Court 4 years later. Today, Missouri has no photo ID law. Bills that would require it have been proposed in the Missouri legislature several times in every legislative session for the past 6 years or so. Every time, and as you probably know, the Missouri legislature has been controlled by the Republican Party with very large majorities for quite some time. But in every case, the Democratic governor, who at this point is Jay Nixon, has said, if that bill passes, I will veto it. It's never even come up for a vote. So the phenomenon appears to be that if you have mixed government, these in the United States, by and large, these photo ID laws don't go anywhere. They may be in the form of proposed legislation, but they don't seem to move. This is a list from, by the way, if you want to get my slides afterwards, just let me know. This is a list that is straight from a website of the National Council of State Legislatures that shows which states have photo ID laws and which have ID laws that don't require a photo. But they break it down. It's the column on the left side. Those are the photo ID states. And they break it down between strict and non-strict. Let me tell you what that means. Non-strict means that in certain circumstances, the voter can vote without producing a photo ID. The procedures differ from state to state, but this is how this council has categorized it. On the other hand, the strict photo ID states still allow potential voters to cast provisional ballots. Kansas is one of those. If you want your ballot to be counted, you have to come to an appropriate election office within a relatively short period of time. Some states it's as few as 3 days. Kansas, as Kris indicated, is between 6 and 9, depending on the county. And so if you show up with your driver's license or your passport or one of the other identifications that's in the list approved by the SAFE Act, your ballot will change from provisional to an actual counted ballot. Here's the question. Is there really rampant voter fraud in the United States? That is the articulated rationale, particularly for the photo ID laws, to prevent in-person voter fraud. It doesn't prevent fraudulent registration. We can get to that in a few minutes. It has to do with in-person voter fraud. You show up at the polls and you're either not the person you allege to be, or you are, you voted in the county next door and now you want to vote here as well. So is there enough evidence of voter fraud to justify a law that arguably would have the effect of reducing the number of voter-eligible people? And here, let me do a little defining here. You have to make a distinction between someone who is of voting age and someone who is voter eligible. It's two different things. Voting age is anybody over the age of 18. Voter eligible means people over the age of 18 who are not otherwise disqualified from voting. So what's the evidence of election results that have actually been changed by in-person voter fraud? First, let me show you, this is a table, it shows you how many elected officials there are in the United States. Over 500,000. Over 500,000 people are elected. Federal, and state, and county, and municipal, and school district, and water district, and any other district you can think of, elections in the United States. Some every 2 years, some every 4 years, but these are the number of elected officials we have. That shows you how many elections we actually have in the United States. So we have, in all probability, tens of thousands of elections, certainly every other year, in even number of years. How many local governments do we have? And this comes from the U.S. Census 2012. In Kansas, we have over 38 local governments. And if you think, well, that's a lot compared to other states, adjacent states, pretty close. My state, nearly 3,800, Nebraska, Colorado, and so forth. So that, again, this will give you an indication of how many elections we actually have in the United States. And how many examples of voter fraud do we actually have? We really don't have many at all. In some cases, none at all. Now, Kris mentioned a chart that he put together, or somebody in his office put together, that indicates that there were 200-odd cases of voter fraud in Kansas over about a 15-year period. As I read that table, I don't see any indications that these alleged cases, and they're alleged, this is a table of reported cases of voter fraud, that any of these cases involve in-person voter impersonation. And there certainly have been no prosecutions for voter impersonation. Let me talk about the most recent case that has been fully litigated on voter ID, and that's a case out of Wisconsin involving the Wisconsin statute passed a few years ago and was challenged in federal court. The federal district court overturned the law as being unconstitutional. That was reversed by a panel of the Seventh Circuit. And then on a petition for rehearing en banc, that was denied by an equal 5-5 vote. And the significant thing, and then cert was denied this past March. And full disclosure, I wrote a brief to the Supreme Court in support of the court to grant cert. But the thing that came out of the Frank versus Walker case is Judge Posner's dissent from the denial of rehearing en banc. If you want to read something that will tell you the pros and cons of these laws, read that. 30 pages long. It's fascinating reading. Came out last October, I believe it was. And Posner had written the Seventh Circuit's opinion in the Marion County case, the case that resulted in the 2008 Supreme Court's decision. And here are a couple of quotes. Some of the evidence of voter impersonation fraud is downright goofy, if not paranoid, such as the non-existent buses that, according to the True the Vote movement, transport foreigners and reservation Indians to polling places. And then this is a really good one. As there is no evidence that voter impersonation fraud is a problem, how can the fact that a legislature says it's a problem turn it into one? If the Wisconsin legislature says witches are a problem, shall Wisconsin courts then be permitted to conduct witch trials? And then here's where he sort of put his stamp on it. He says that the real motivation for these laws is to, as I underlined here, discourage voting by persons likely to vote against the party responsible for imposing the burdens. Quickly, the Kansas law. This slide has a list, and I forgot to put in the student ID, but Kris is absolutely correct. This slide has a list of the types of photo identification that comply with the Kansas statute. what I'm going to finish on is this. And this is where the numbers get very confusing. You can almost say what you make them say what you want them to say. In 2010, and this is according to an article that the secretary wrote in the Syracuse Law Review, there were 2,126,179 voter age Kansans. Voter age, not voter eligible, voter age Kansans. And there were 2.156 million licensed drivers or people who had non-driver IDs. So his argument was there's an excess of photo IDs. But let's look at what's the issue here. It's that not everybody who has a license can vote. Any of you ever vote until you turned 18? Who didn't have a driver's license when you turned 18? In Kansas, there are about 80,000 people, youngsters, who have driver's licenses, but they're not old enough to vote. Similarly, under the Kansas Constitution, felons lose the right to vote. In the last 6 years, between 2007 and 2013, there were about 34,000 felons released from Kansas state prisons. I'm not talking federal prisons, Kansas state prisons. Let's assume most of them actually live in Kansas. They can get a driver's license, but they can't vote. So, you put this all together, if you assume, well, what this comes up with is, when I do the calculation, there are about 3.4% of voting eligible Kansans who don't have driver's licenses. So, I think it shows that there is a question, about the numbers. Sorry for going too long.
All right, can we get a round of applause?